I'm Will Fenton. I'm the Director of Research and Public Programs at the Library Company of Philadelphia. The Library Company, if you don't already know it, is a library founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731. We have grown and matured and evolved in a lot of interesting ways over the past 300 odd years. And today we're a wonderful research library. And we have a terrific fellowships program that supports researchers from all over, not just the country, but all over the world that are doing research with our collections, working with our collections, and of course also working with our expert staff. And that's what sort of makes this particular program so special, because we're going to be hearing about a former fellow who's worked very closely with one of our favorite staff members, Godey King. So the seminar series is something that's really been going in its current form since 2018. Traditionally, these would happen in the reading room, which is where you'll see Connie King is currently located. I am masquerading, I'm pretending to be in the Logan room right now, but this is just the background here. In that reading room, we often pull all sorts of wonderful materials from our collections. It's an opportunity for people to really get up close and personal with our collections and have a real curated experience and a through line that takes you through all those collections. Now, of course, since March, we've had to adapt and we've moved these online. And one of the benefits to that is that we can serve all sorts of folks that aren't local, and we can offer these for free, which is really important to us in terms of access. So thank you in advance for taking a little time out of your Wednesday evening to join us. This is something that's going to look a little bit familiar in the sense that it's Zoom, but it's Zoom in a different way. This is Zoom webinar. So you'll see that your face isn't up on the screen. Right now we just have our seminar leader, our curator, Connie King, and you're stuck with me as well. But I encourage you to pose your questions as they arise using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you cursor around, you'll see a little sort of overlapping dialogue box, or I guess you would say overlapping dialogue balloons. Click that and you can type in your question whenever you have it. And I encourage you to record it as soon as you have it, because if you're anything like me, you don't write it, you'll forget it. I will do my best to moderate those questions when we get towards the very end of this session. But I think the idea that we're going to get a presentation from our seminar leader, and then it will open up to questions. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Connie King, who is our Chief of Reference and our Curator of Women's History, and also the curator of a brand new exhibition that opens next week called Women Get Things Done, who's working very closely with our seminar leader and who can do a much better job introducing her than I could.
Thank you, Will. I've been looking forward to tonight for months. I was thrilled when Will suggested that we have this seminar that would be tied in with the Women Get Things Done exhibition that Will just mentioned. The show will virtually open next Tuesday, so you folks are getting a preview tonight. When Will suggested a seminar, I knew immediately who we should ask to conduct the sessions. It had to be Dr. Amy Sopcak Joseph, who is Assistant Professor of History at Wilkes University. Amy and I have collaborated on Women Get Things Done, and her own research focuses on one of the women profiled in the show, Sarah Josepha Hale, the remarkably prolific editor of Godey's Ladies' Book in the 19th century. And this is a spoiler alert here, Amy, I'm sorry. Amy has written a lot about Godey's. And I'm telling you her story. Sarah Hale was one of the most successful businesswomen in 19th century America, but she didn't support women getting the right to vote. And she said so explicitly in the columns of Godey's. Both Amy and I have talked about this at various times, and we've been intrigued by the apparent contradiction. When I started working on the exhibition, it was back in 2016, right after the national election. I was fascinated by the fact that many women oppose the idea of a woman running for president on principle. I couldn't shake the idea that some of the public conversations about women's participation in political life in the 21st century sounded a lot like discussions about gender roles in the 19th century, even though we have come to think of the passage of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote as a watershed moment in women's rights. And Amy's work on Sarah Hale came to mind, and she's been a terrific collaborator. When I was thinking about tonight, I was thinking about all the things that have happened in the last few months. Could the many upheavals of 2020 present us with an opportunity to re-examine the history of systemic issues, misogyny as well as racism, prejudice against people who are poor, people who are disabled, people who are gender nonconforming, naturalized citizens and non-citizens? I truly believe that historians such as Amy Sopcak Joseph have a vital role in helping us with the process of re-examining the past and working towards a better future. Amy.
Well, thank you, both Will and Connie, for that. I'd really like to thank Will Fenton first for extending this invitation to do one of the library company's 2 fall seminars this year. I know, they don't do a ton of these, so it's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you over the next couple of weeks about these things. Almost 10 years ago, when I set out to begin the research that resulted in my dissertation, the library company was the first archive that I visited. I spent 3 short days poking around in a few volumes of Godey's Lady's Book, a couple of Philadelphia city directories, and I got to talk a little bit with Connie King and with Jim Green when I was there in the reading room. Since then, I've considered the library company to be an intellectual home for my project and for me as well. And of course, I found that Connie shares this fascination with the Lady's Book and with Sarah Josepha Hale as well. So we've spent a lot of time talking and thinking about Hale and her roles. So way back in 2018, Connie approached me about providing some feedback on this new exhibit that she was really starting to work on, or really had already started to lay out at that point. And I jumped at the chance to offer some feedback and eventually became an official collaborator with her. The idea was for an exhibit that would likely coincide with this centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And its title has gone through at least a dozen iterations. We've gone back and forth about the title over and over and over again. Is it too long? Are there too many words? How do you sum up something that's actually so complicated into something that people want to hear about? My daily challenge as a history professor too. So we've gone through a number of iterations for this title, trying to encapsulate that women's history of caretaking and of activism has a really long history, and yet that history is also very complicated. It's not a straightforwardly progressive or celebratory story. And actually, I forgot, I should share my screen with you all as well. Which one did we figure out it was? This one. So you should be able to see, yes? Yes. So this first installment of debating woman's place in America from 1860 to 1880, I'm dedicating to spheres and suffrage. And I'll get to that title in a second. So why women get things done and why now? A focus on the period prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment seemed like a useful way that we could, I think, contribute to this larger discussion going on through the year. And also, I know Connie was working to really highlight the strengths of the library company's collections. And this was a period where holdings were particularly strong. And we'll be talking a little more about those specifically in other sessions, like particularly next week. And as Connie started to put everything together, and then I was providing feedback, the exhibit's sections ended up being questions, questions that are up for debate. What can women do? What are they doing for themselves? How can they do more? What more can they do besides what they are doing now? How can they, quote unquote, fix problems that they see in the world? Can women even agree upon what problems there are that need to be fixed? And we quickly agreed together that the path through the 19th century was not a linear one. These are things that have been debated, these are questions that have been debated over time. And the one consistency has been two strains of disagreement. One arguing for power in women's equality, and the other arguing for power in women's differences from men. And I do want to say and make clear that this is not a seminar program focused on the retelling of the history of the women's suffrage movement itself. That's not really, it's kind of part of the exhibit, but not a real focus, and it's not going to be my focus either. There have been many very high quality programs offered this year that cover that kind of material. I highly recommend Will's fireside chat with Dr. Allison Lang on picturing political power, images in the women's suffrage movement. PBS's American Experience also offered a 2-night blockbuster this summer called The Vote back in July. My interest focuses on the way that discussions of women's suffrage intersect with other cultural conversations about women's roles in the 19th century. So those are a lot of the objectives that I kind of laid out for this program, to explore women's roles in society and to examine those debates over what's ideal, but also the reality on the ground, not just in the print culture that we're looking at. So we want to start off by talking, by going backwards a little bit. I'm going to dwell quite a bit before 1860 tonight, but also knowing that these ideals that I'm talking about extend through this time period that's covered by the exhibit itself. But for the moment, I want to step back for a second to talk about who could be political, who embraced, who was able to exercise suffrage in the new nation, because I think this story to some extent actually can be rooted in that, the idea of the Constitution itself and the state constitutions. And tomorrow's Constitution Day, so you get a little Constitution Day preview. Why couldn't women vote in the new nation? Well, lots of people couldn't vote in the new nation. Suffrage was tied to property ownership, as opposed to being tied to necessarily citizenship or sex, gender, race, things like that. So the US Constitution did not specify itself what made someone eligible to vote. That's left to state constitutions to decide. And from the Revolutionary War through the early 1800s, states wrote their own constitutions, laying out state government and voter eligibility. Well, there was not so much debate about whether politics fell within men's purview. There was a debate about whether all men deserved the right to vote. And in many of those initial state constitutions, the first iterations of those constitutions, enfranchisement was often limited to white men who owned property. It's so important in this period, at least. Americans of the founding era were mostly concerned about limiting voting to individuals who could make rational decisions, free from the influence of others, whether that other is a landlord or a husband, a father, or a master. So property ownership was a kind of signal that an individual had achieved a particular degree of independence, and that person deserved the right to vote. And I should mention, by extension, the right to hold office. So this is excluding a variety of populations living in the new United States. This included some white men. It included white women. It included Black men and women. It included Native Americans, in terms of groups who are kind of off to the side of deserving enfranchisement. And it's not until the 1810s through roughly the 1840s that many states begin to revisit their constitutions and rewrite what those rules are. The situation changes over the course of time. States increasingly dropped the property qualifications that people needed in order to exercise the right to vote, redefining who was enfranchised. Politics became something that linked all white men, regardless of social class, and that distinguished them from other groups. And that's going to be a theme here, kind of defining who gets to belong to a group and who is excluded from those groups. And I have here the continuing importance of the legal concept of couverture. Earlier, this is a concept that develops from English law and then is brought across the ocean. This idea of couverture, that women's legal rights were really a subset of her husband's. As a couple, they were basically considered to be one legal unit. So a married woman's kind of legal identity is subsumed under that of her husband. As Enlightenment ideas about liberty and potential equality mingled with these legal concepts and religious arguments about gender, we begin to see kind of complex arguments like one that was made by Catherine Beecher emerge into the American debate. So Beecher herself was a woman who was a proponent of women's education, and she's, by the time she's saying this in 1837, is actually a pretty well-known kind of personality at this point. But she starts to make an argument like this. So heaven has appointed one sex as superior, and to the other the subordinate station, and this without any reference to the character or conduct of either. But while woman holds a subordinate relation in society to the other sex, it is not because it was designed that her duties or her influence should be any less important or all-pervading. It was designed that the mode of gaining influence and of exercising power should be altogether different and peculiar. She goes on to say, woman is to win everything by peace and love, by making herself so much respected, esteemed, and loved that to yield to her opinions and to gratify her wishes will be the free will offering of the heart. But this is to be all accomplished in the domestic and social circle. The moment woman begins to feel the promptings of ambition or the thirst for power, her aegis of deference is gone. And I wanted to quote her here in bulk, basically, because I think she's making so many arguments on top of each other. There are so many layers here. This is not exactly arguing by 1837 that women should not pay attention to issues like anti-slavery debates or like debates over the Indian Removal Act. This is not exactly saying that women shouldn't try to wield power or influence, but she's not arguing that this influence should be overt or public. Woman is to work behind the scenes, influencing the men in her life to make these right decisions. And really, she's not talking about couverture overtly here, but this is really what she's talking about within this legal system where a wife's husband would have this political power, this kind of public political power. This argument here that she's making is linked to a religious argument too, that women are to be subordinate. And perhaps most interestingly, it's that women should not exercise ambition, that somehow this kind of desire to have public influence is linked to a public desire for ambition, which I just find to be endlessly interesting, endlessly fascinating, coming from a woman who had founded the Hartford Female Seminary almost 20 years earlier, who had published a number of works, had written a textbook to teach from, and who would go on to write and publish for a number of decades after this. Catherine Beecher was not herself a stranger to kind of the public. So here, why is she doing this? How does all of this kind of make sense? And this links to the reading the kind of pre-reading that I sent out or had Will send out. I wanted to go all the way back in terms of kind of thinking about scholarship. I wanted to go backwards to feature Barbara Welter's article on the cult of true womanhood. And looking at the participant list, I know at least some of you are quite familiar with this article already. And I think there's still a lot to say about what's going on in this article, or a lot to extend from. So this is a foundational article, I would argue, in terms of kind of understanding what is going on with ideals about gender in the 19th century. And this, I'm highlighting here that this is based on an analysis of printed resources, printed primary sources, religious tracts, women's magazines, including Godey's Lady's Book, but numerous other magazines, poetry collections, advice manuals, a whole kind of world of printed material that was available to women and to men in this 19th century period. And she highlights what she identifies as cardinal virtues of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, which she kind of overwhelms us with the evidence for, right? She has plenty of evidence that people are talking about these ideas, people are writing about these ideas throughout this period in a variety of contexts overall. So these ideals were widely written about, yes, that's part of what she's telling us. But I think these ideals have their limits, and I think they deserve, to some extent, almost a reevaluation, or what I think I'm trying to do is to try to expand on some of those, or think about how those might change over time in my own work. I still maintain that Welter's article provides a kind of quick and clear map about these ideas about women's roles of the time period. That white women, in particular white middle-class women, are expected to be the kind of holders of piety within and morality within their families, that they're supposed to direct the religious education of their children, that they're supposed to maintain their purity throughout kind of courtship, but also kind of maintain this pure influence within their families and communities, that they are not totally in control of their fate and their lives, as they're supposed to be submissive to the men in their lives and to God's will. And undoubtedly, these pieces are showing that women and men are talking about women's roles being centered within the home, within domestic space. But there are, of course, limits to this. This really applied to white middle class and aspiring middle class women. There were plenty of groups who could not fulfill these virtues, who could not always fulfill these virtues, or sometimes ever fulfill these virtues, particularly that dedicated to domesticity. Women living in rural areas, working class women, enslaved Black women and free Black women couldn't necessarily fit within this framework. And this was intentional. The emphasis on domesticity, I think in particular, was in part to define this burgeoning middle class from other groups of Americans. But also, I would argue that not everyone really agreed on how to define these virtues or how to weigh them. I mean, I've spent a lot of time reading Godey's Lady's Book, as Connie has already pointed out. I've spent a lot of time reading stories over time and trying to track whether this is a consistent message, whether the magazine is providing a consistent message, or whether we can detect kind of changes or maybe waves throughout this time. And very few of these items, I would say, hit all four of these virtues explicitly. I think sometimes it comes off as though everything was talking about all of these virtues all at once, and they're not. It's often easy to find one of these virtues in there, but very rarely do you find fiction or nonfiction that is hitting all of these things at once explicitly. But also, I think some of the points that Welter makes may deserve more attention. Submission, for example. I think a lot about this when I'm reading the stories from Godey's both fiction and some of the editorials from Sarah Hale. Welter's analysis here favors evidence that submission was meant to be submissive. Women are meant to be submissive to the men in their lives. They're meant to be submissive to their husbands. And she does mention that they're supposed to also be submissive to God's will. She has about a paragraph there or something like that. But at least in terms of the reading I've done, what has stuck out to me is how often this idea of the submission to God's will comes up. Actually, it's a tag. One of my research tags is the idea of "thy will be done," because it's often expressed explicitly in these terms, that something terrible has happened, something very tough has happened. Your husband has lost his fortune in the financial panic, or your young child has gotten sick and passed away. And the way to kind of reconcile that for yourself is that this is God's will at work in your life. And at other times, this message is really explicit. Sarah Hale, Connie talked a little bit about Sarah Hale already, and I'll talk a little bit more about her in a second. She faced a number of really tough situations in her life, and she, some of her most, I think, moving editorials connect to this idea that she's trying to accept God's will in her life. So I think that looking at things like this, how often are we seeing submission come up in a particular context? And at the same time, I should also say there are also plenty of stories with ineffective fathers who spoil girls, or who have kind of no input at all in the courtship process. So I'm not so sure that I'm always seeing submission to men in these stories either, but that's for another analysis, I guess. So what I want to expand on is how powerful these gender ideals are through this case study, because we love Sarah Hale so much. And because she provides such a clear example of how complex this debate is. And I've read and grappled with how complicated and contradictory this is over time, and I'm still kind of making sense of it, but I'll try to make her viewpoints here as clear as possible. Hale was born in New Hampshire in 1787 and did not attend school herself. She was educated by her mother and her brother actually went on to attend Dartmouth. Bookish Sarah taught school for a couple years before she married a local lawyer named David Hale. And David died just before Sarah gave birth to their 5th child. So what did she do in this situation, now alone with 4 and then 5 children? She hustled to find ways to support her family. She briefly went into the millinery business, making hats with her sister-in-law, which, by the way, I think actually scarred her for life. I think part of why she dislikes fashion so much is that she didn't like making hats for fashionable ladies. So she goes into business with her sister-in-law, but that's short-lived. And it's through a writing career that Sarah was not only able to raise her children, but she became a household name as the editor of Philadelphia's Godey's Ladies Book. Hale used her platform as editor to advocate for numerous causes, particularly women's education, but education was only one of these pieces, really. She was involved for a time in the Boston Seamen's Aid Society, which raised money to fund programs for the wives and families of sailors. She undertook not one, but 2 campaigns to raise money for the Bunker Hill Monument that now stands in Charleston, Massachusetts. And she wrote stories, first for a magazine in Boston called the Ladies Magazine, and then many, many stories in the Ladies Book, and as well as publishing books on her own, both advice manuals and kind of collections of sketches, poetry, things like that. Hale is a really useful example of the contradictory nature of these gender expectations, because she was not a housewife herself, but she created this national career as a proponent of domesticity among her countrywomen. And I want to link us here. I've given you kind of her background. She is a writer. She's a businesswoman. She is someone who specifically made decisions about how to kind of run her life, how to live her life, based on being able to provide her family. And she never remarries or anything like that. She doesn't try to remake the domestic ideal through her kind of personal choices, but she advocates for this pretty consistently within her magazine and other materials. But today I actually want to highlight, this will be a surprise to some people, I actually want to highlight her argument in a book called Woman's Record that she published in 1853. She spent, and I know Connie loves this book too, she spent at least 3 years researching and writing Woman's Record, which was a huge compendium. It's a very long book that is a collection of biographies of famous women. And in Woman's Record, Hale breaks up history into 4 time periods where she kind of tracks this what she considers to be progress over time for women's roles from kind of the ancient world up to her present day. And so she spends a lot of time researching, writing these biographies of women who are long dead, but she's also very interested in highlighting living Americans and British writers who are participating in the conversations that she is part of. So I want to talk a little bit at the very beginning. She has this great kind of overview of where she lays out why she's doing this project that it has taken her an incredible amount of time to work on, while she's also doing these other things like editing the ladies' book. And she makes a very clear argument for her viewpoint on gender difference, but how that's actually a really powerful thing to her. She goes in and provides her own reading of the book of Genesis in order to justify women's roles as what she calls as preserver, teacher or inspirer, and the exemplar for men in their lives. So she starts by saying, she has a kind of caveat here. Permit me that I am not aiming to remark here that I'm not aiming to controvert the authority of the husband or the right of men to make laws for the world they are to subdue and govern. I have no sympathy for those who are wrangling for women's rights. And she says this, as Connie said, over and over again. She's not sympathetic to those who want women's rights, nor with those who are foolishly urging my sex to strive for equality and competition with men. What I seek to establish is the Bible doctrine as I understand it, that woman was intended as the teacher and inspirer for man, morally speaking, of whatsoever things are lovely and pure, and of the good report. The Bible does not uphold the equality of the sexes. When created, man and woman were unlike in 3 important respects. And she goes on to lay out her reasoning for this. So first, she argues that man was made of earth, but woman was made of flesh. So we have this difference in their creation to begin with. Hale takes this a step further by arguing that woman was the last work of creation. So in Genesis, it is laid out all of these pieces that God has created, and that woman was the last piece of all of them. This seems really significant to her. And so because she was this last piece of creation, God took more care with making of woman. She is of a finer mold, and she is the kind of crowning achievement of God. Then she turns to analyze the story of the fall of man, the story of Adam and Eve. Men, she argues, have looked at this story and represent woman as inferior and blamable based on the fact that that Eve accepted the serpent's temptation. But Hale argues that woman could not have been both inferior and blamable in this situation. She actually goes so far as to say, or to point out, that Eve was not alone in this. Adam was tempted along beside her. She's making this argument that Adam was tempted alongside of her. Why didn't Adam step in and restrain or warn his wife in this situation? And furthermore, she argues that woman is not naturally depraved because God said to the serpent that he would put enmity between thee and woman. So she's reading into the scripture that if Eve were naturally corrupt, how could God be then creating this enmity between them? She sees that she's reading into this, that this is kind of highlighting a difference that already exists between Eve and this evilness. Hale uses this point to reinforce, or uses this to reinforce her point about how woman is at the center of moral progress. And that this is linked to Christianity. I mean, part of what she's really concerned about in her argument here is that Christianity is incredibly important for women's progress, for the kind of role of women, particularly in the United States and in Britain. So she doesn't want to throw the Christian framework out of this completely. And yet at the same time, she is offering her own very specific reading of what is going on in the book of Genesis at this point. So she is someone who she's not arguing for the power of women in terms of extending ideas of their equality. She's really centering their ideas of power in this difference that she is rooting in this biblical story. She's not arguing for women's right to vote or women's equality, because she doesn't see that as necessarily powerful for the women around her. She's more concerned that women be literate and maintain or gain an education so that they could interact and morally influence the men around them. Then she sees a kind of public political role, or kind of partisan political role, I should probably say, for American women around her. And so it's within this context where we have these really complicated arguments, complex arguments about whether women are equal or whether they are not, and how do we set up these distinctions that we have the women's rights movement kind of entering into. So I want to say just a little bit at the end here, or to wrap up my kind of formal presentation soon, to think a little bit about womanhood and women's suffrage in this kind of mid-century period. Because it's through this debate over where women's power might center that we end up with things like the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls in 1848. And this is linked to this kind of deeper history of women's involvement, first in campaigns, or partially in campaigns petitioning Congress against the Indian Removal Act, and also becoming involved in this anti-slavery and abolition movement. As women are dealing with these ideas, these kind of Enlightenment ideas, some are beginning to question their own situation and starting to apply those arguments to the things that are around them. And so in Seneca Falls in 1848, a number of women's rights supporters are joined together in order to think about this and put together the Declaration of Sentiments. And I included two things here that I think are particularly important and that were striking to me. So of course, as we can see, they were taking these pieces inspired by and kind of revising the ideas from the Declaration of Independence itself. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, they're endowed by their creator, all of these things. So we're picking up on this idea of equality, so very different from what Hale is trying to argue and make in her arguments there. But as we go through, this declaration is not just focused on the right for women's suffrage. There's a really long list of other really important things that they are citing as their concerns that are suffrage is one among a number of tyrannical acts by men, according to this declaration. And these include making laws that women need to submit to that they have not helped to create, that woman must promise obedience to her husband, linking back to that idea of coverture, that woman has or lacks a kind of legal identity, that woman cannot claim guardianship over her children in the case of a divorce, that higher education and that church positions are closed to women, and that men and women have to follow different moral codes. So this goes well beyond that kind of women's rights argument in terms of just suffrage. There's a whole kind of network of things that are of concern here. And as I was looking through this more recently, this one particularly struck my conscience at this point. And this is towards the end of the document, that man has endeavored to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. And I was thinking a lot of this in comparison to what Hale is saying, both in the ladies' book, but particularly these ideas in Woman's Record. Because I think looking back from today, wanting to see the progress that is being made, wanting to see a kind of feminist strain from the 19th century into the 20th century, it's easy to kind of discount how powerful women legitimately believing and buying into ideas like Hale talked about, like Hale wrote about, that somehow they must not have completely understood what was going on, or that that they must be kind of victim to this idea that man has destroyed her confidence in her powers, that she must be dependent and abject. But I wouldn't argue that people like Hale or like Catherine Beecher, for example, who's also making similar arguments, I don't think they're making these distinctions based on a place of feeling unequal or lesser. And I think this is a really important kind of change from maybe earlier arguments prior to the creation of the United States about differences between the sexes as one being subordinate and one being more superior. I think Hale is making this argument that women are just as important and wield just as much power, but they're doing so in a different way. And that's a really important piece for her. So I see this piece here potentially speaking not only to men who are making these arguments about kind of women's weakness or women's difference, but also speaking to some extent to people like Hale and to other kind of women who are making these more conservative arguments. Because clearly her argument is kind of intersecting here with some of the things that the group writing the Declaration of Sentiments were and approving of this declaration were concerned about. Hale was just as concerned about education as these people were. But for her, the end is something different. So part of why I kind of wanted to move back to this or move us to suffrage and think a little bit about suffrage tonight is that we have these arguments being made on both of these sides, and we have a very clear argument being made for women's equality and demands for women's equality being made in the mid 1800s. And yet it's going to be another 80 or so years until the 19th Amendment was ratified. So how could this be that it took so long? It's partially the power of this kind of dominant gender ideal, the power of things like what Hale is writing in Woman's Record, what's being reproduced in these advice books and poetry collections and other women's magazines that Welter is collecting here. That this was the dominant idea, and that there are far more critics of women's rights, and far more critics of the idea that women were equal to men than there were for people, of people who were actually supporting this. One study found that about 40% of newspaper accounts about the Seneca Falls Convention printed negative assessments, while about 29% said favorable things about this, which makes some sense when you're thinking about a wide kind of audience who are reading these kinds of ideas about maybe women's power being linked not necessarily to their equality, but to these very specific differences. So we now look back at the suffrage movement, hailing these women, the women who are working towards this, as heroines, which I don't disagree with. But I think it's important to remember that within this context, within this centennial that we're celebrating this year, that they were fighting also against dominant gender ideals that both women and men were very, very invested in, and that women are making very popular reputations around to advocate for these things. And so to some extent, it's not terribly surprising that it's taking so long for these things to kind of filter down and or filter through society and become embraced more widely, because they're filtering through both this print culture that is, sorry, there's a cat over there. It's filtering through print culture that was incredibly popular and incredibly influential throughout this kind of long time period. So this is largely, you're not going anywhere, I know, but this is largely what I have prepared for us today, because I want to continue to think. I haven't been looking at the questions because they were minimized when I shared this thing. But I want to continue to think with you about the contradictory pieces of this in terms of what Beecher, and particularly what Hale is doing, and how these link back to this suffrage movement. So I'm going to look to Will potentially for help with navigating questions and commentary that has come in.
It's my pleasure. And thank you for that wonderful presentation. And for all of you that are still with us, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature, but there's another option. You can raise your hand virtually, not physically, because I won't be able to see it, but virtually, and then we can actually grant you speaking. Right. So I've got a comment here from Carrie Bryan that I think is sort of interesting for you. She writes, having done some research into Sarah Hale, I think she was, yes, a conundrum to us modern historians. But I think she absolutely subscribed to the early 19th century trope of the woman's role as being the moral exemplar, the pure spirit who would teach and inspire her male children to be democratic leaders. But by being who she was, by sheer genius and charisma, she herself defied the gender delineations she sought to defend.
I like to think of her, she must have been such a formidable force to interact with, just by dint of how much material that she produced over time, and how not only in terms of kind of her writing, but as I said, these other, or at least early on, her contributions to these other pieces in terms of what she was doing in Boston, pushing through fundraising for the Bunker Hill Monument. Later, she's actually involved too. She and I think the Ladies' Book are involved a bit in the push for creating Mount Vernon. I was looking at this and it just went somewhere else. Oh, maybe it's unanswered. Oh. She absolutely, though, was advocating for women as this moral example. And I think part of what she's really trying to do there in Woman's Record is find a way to reconcile her her dedication to this to Protestant or Episcopal faith, and looking at these stories, looking at scripture to try to justify why women are not depraved, sinful creatures, and why they should be this moral center, this moral example. I don't know that she necessarily needed to do that. I think there was plenty of other literature that was out there at the same time that was making these same arguments. This is part of why I'm fascinated with this early piece, this preface in Woman's Record, because she's very clearly also kind of stepping out of the very role she's talking about to, or advocating for, to interpret scripture for herself. So there's just, this is why I too am continually fascinated by her, because there's so many complicated layers that I think sound like cognitive dissonance to us, but that we're not dissonant within her actions.
So on the topic of Woman's Record, we actually have a question from Jess Linker asking about how Woman's Record was generally received. And I want to invite Jess, if she's interested, to sort of summarize a little bit of the context here, because she's clearly done a lot of research here, and I'm going to do a terrible job reading this, and I don't want to do her a
Right, sorry, as I try to read it as well. Hello, Jessica.
Hi, Amy. I can unmute myself.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you've heard me talk about this series of letters before, but
yes.
You know, there's a correspondence between Emma Willard and Lydia Sigourney in the early 1850s, and they are furious with Hale, partly because of something that went down while Willard was trying to divorce Christopher Yates in Boston,
Yes.
but partly related to the publication of what I think must be this work. Because they're referring to something where she is writing about them, and they're really annoyed by how just generally poorly executed it is, and it's not always clear to me like why they are so upset about it. You know, fundamentally, like Willard and Sigourney don't have like radically different ideas about women and their roles comparatively, but I was curious, like, if you had a sense of, like, you know, do you know specific people who read this and said, oh, I agree with this or dislike this, because there's, I think, a spectrum of women, you know, who buy into this idea of complementary sexes, right, who see men and women, particularly in a marriage scenario, as having roles in which the woman is good at some things and the man is good at others, and there are many different iterations of this. But they later go on to be either suffragists or anti-suffragists. They can go either way, and certainly Willard and Beecher end up being anti-suffragists. So I'm just kind of curious, like, it's funny that Willard is so upset about this, and I wonder if, like, the book itself could be kind of like a way to think about, like, how people are reacting to this, even though you say you're not that interested in how it links to suffrage in this moment.
Well, I think that this is a place definitely for more reading and thinking. I mean, I'd have to go back and look at what she's saying about both Sigourney and Willard. I know Hale includes various people who she disagrees with, and some of them, like, I know she includes Margaret Fuller as well, and, like, talks about, you know, that she's you know, a female genius, but is maybe a little misled on her beliefs. So Hale does these kind of backhanded things where she includes people because she sees them as important, but she doesn't always talk about them in ways that are particularly flattering, or she makes it very clear where she thinks that they have gone from the path. So I'd have to go back and look. I know you've mentioned this thing before, and actually I think I'm intrigued by the idea of calling her Crocodilia, because of course I think of her as formidable, but maybe there's a flip side to that too. To see how she's maybe backhandedly saying something about Sigourney, and I'd have to go, I know that she and Willard have a huge falling out over Willard's separation from her husband. So I can't remember off the top of my head if she even includes Willard in the book, because she does make some decisions about who to include and who not to include that I think are kind of politically motivated. There's a woman whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, who was a pretty famous writer from Boston during Hale's time in Boston in the 1820s and 30s, and who edited a rival periodical. This woman does not show up in Woman's Record, and I'm pretty sure that it's a slight by Hale because they get into a tiff over the Bunker Hill Monument. So I think she is both trying to produce a history to tell this story, but is also clearly has some personal axes to grind within what she's saying too.
Thank you, Jess. And for the rest of you, if you do want to just ask your question the old-fashioned way through audio, just raise your hand and I'll make sure I keep an eye on it for you. I've got a textual question there from Stephen Peitzman, who asks, do the writers cited in the Cult of True the Cult of True Womanhood reflect some reality, at least for some middle-class women, or is it aiming to create the reality? Or are these writers, women and men, writing within some old-fashioned world of their own?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, there are some middle-class families who are able to create this ideal where a woman can fulfill their roles as homemaker and mother. There's numerous women writers at this time too who we know struggle because they've gone to some of these female academies, they've been educated and have gained this sense of education and want to continue their careers, and yet the pressures of family, the pressures of reality do not allow them to have that much time. Mary Kelly's book, Learning to Stand and Speak, does a really great job of tracing out the history of women's education, but also dealing a bit with the reality that some of these women faced in terms of writing. And I think this is why Hale is such an important and interesting example of this, because she's raising her children for part of the time that she's working at the Ladies' Book. But she's already in her 40s by the time she really starts her editorial career. So she lives to be in her 80s or early 80s. So she spends a lot of her career, her antebellum and just immediately post-Civil War career, as an older woman who does not have the same kind of domestic responsibilities that other women have. And I think that allows her to have that kind of career. But there's also a really healthy amount for whom these things that are being talked about, the stories that are being written, the advice that's being provided is aspirational, and not just on the East Coast. Women who are living in small towns or living in areas where maybe you could achieve the middle class ideal, but thinking as women are moving westward towards the kind of Midwest or going all the way out to California. Godey's Ladies' Book and these printed materials are following those women to those places. They're accessible, but whether they are actually able to kind of recreate this ideal completely on the ground is a real challenge over time. And this is part of what I'm trying to suss out in my larger project. Like, what use do you have for the Ladies' Book in California? Because I know it's there, but what exactly are you doing with it? So there's, I think, still room for us to figure out what exactly that meant to those people too. So thank you for that question.
Christy Bartlett asks, how did the women who are fighting so hard for the vote view someone like Sarah Hale?
I don't have any direct quotes to give you in terms of how exactly any of them viewed her, but I mean, to some extent, their coming from similar places in that they're envisioning power and influence for women in their families and in their communities. The way they're going about this, though, is very, very different. And I think this is part of my real curiosity, is that, you know, at least in terms of the early piece with Seneca Falls, at that point, these ideas about women's rights are still, are not dominant. But as the Ladies' Book continues its publishing run after the Civil War, and as women's rights become far more dominant in the conversation, the circulation of the Ladies' Book also declines. And I haven't proven it yet, but part of I think there's a number of things going on as to why Hale and her work are becoming less popular. But I suspect that it is linked to the increasing conversation around women's rights, particularly as we get towards the passage of the 14th Amendment and the huge kind of debate that's going on around that. I need to continue to do the research on it, but part of what I'm hoping to do ultimately in my book project is talk about the kind of intersections and how Hale becomes more and more vocal about being against women's suffrage, and whether that's actually a piece that is damaging the reputation of the magazine overall and maybe pushing people to other periodicals and things like that. I know the Revolution ended up being a pretty short-lived periodical, so I'm not sure that people were necessarily driven to suffrage publications like that, but I'm interested in seeing that if these ideas are becoming more palatable to a larger group of Americans, if that's hurting that reputation. And we'll hopefully talk, Connie and I will hopefully talk about Jane Crawley next week or the week after. Jane Crawley is a woman who ends up, she's a journalist, and she ends up becoming the editor of the Ladies' Book in its later iteration in the 1880s and 90s. And Crowley is not particularly pro-suffrage either, which I find to be a kind of fascinating story too. So hopefully we'll pick that up in later sessions too. So I see Rachel's question at the very top, and I'm trying to read it.
I'd be happy to moderate it for you because this intersects nicely with the very first question that we had from Carrie Bryan. She says, "Hi, Amy. Your talk of Sarah Hale has got me thinking. Oftentimes we encounter historical figures who seem like conundrums to us. Yet for people of the time, their apparently contradictory ideals would not have seemed totally normal, or would have seemed totally normal, excuse me. I struggle with this a lot. How should we talk about them? Do we emphasize the contradictions, embrace the fact that people are messy conundrums, interrogate our own assumptions? In other words, why do we think these are contradictions in the first place? And do we do so differently for a scholarly versus popular audience?"
I mean, I think this is part of why I really wanted to highlight not necessarily anti-suffragists, because the other weeks that we do this seminar, we're not necessarily going to highlight this anti-suffrage strain so much, but to think about how complex this debate was, and that not that, now where did the thing go? To think about how complicated this is and understand and present this, that they aren't, where we're looking at them, they seem like conundrums. But like I said, I think we see Hale as having cognitive dissonance. How could she both be a popular author and advocate for domesticity while also not living up to that ideal herself? I don't know that she saw that as incompatible in her period. I think she, I don't think that that's how she saw herself. And I think that this is one of those places where bringing this to both a scholarly and a popular audience is really important. Connie and I have done quite a bit of thinking about about this link to our current day situation, and that we exist in a world that includes many, many women who see themselves as feminists, who advocate for equal opportunity and equal rights for women. And yet we coexist in a world with many, many conservative women who see this very differently, and whom we might also say are suffering from cognitive dissonance or something like that, or maybe are conundrums in terms of, I think a lot of like mommy bloggers and things like that who maybe advocate for this domestic ideal while also making a popular name for themselves. We haven't gotten away from this. I don't think there's a difference. I think this is actually one longer piece in a continuum where we've had this push and pull of progressive and conservative viewpoints. But to me, it was really important to be able to tell a story this year about the path to the 19th Amendment and the path to women's suffrage, that also legitimizes the fact that there was a conservative strain to this, and that we can continue to see that conservative strain today. I'll have to continue to think about whether we do that differently for different audiences. But I think I would at least say that this is an equally important conversation to have, I think, with both, to be, I don't want to say more historically accurate, but to show how complex this debate was. I mean, I don't think it makes sense. The long march to the 19th Amendment doesn't make sense if we don't understand how strong the conservative strain was, and that many, many women are embracing this at the same time. So thank you, Rachel.
That's great. We have a note also from Carrie O'Brien who adds that Sarah Hale did not accede to Godey's invitation to come to Philadelphia to assume what she insisted on called the editress role of the lady's book until her youngest son had graduated from Harvard.
Right. She edited the lady's book essentially afar for the first 4 or so years of her. I mean, she's on the staff. She's on the cover as one of the editors, or editress, as she liked to call herself. But she does that from afar, which is nice because it provides at least a little bit of correspondence between the two. It actually would have been better if she had stayed in Boston for far longer, so they would have had to have written to each other, and I could see what that relationship was like. But unfortunately, then she moves to Philly in 1841, and that stops. So.
That's great.
I can see that Jess is already reading Woman's Record. These are excellent questions and excellent, I mean, things that I'm still working through too, for sure, in terms of my research. I mean, I think there's still a lot of research to be done on women's print culture, particularly in the Civil War and the post-Civil War period, which we'll talk more about as we get down the road here. But I think that there's a lot more to be done, to be thinking about these intersections of kind of dominant women. Is that Woman's Record, Connie? Yeah, I knew you had one on your shelf there. I remember you showing it to me before. I knew it was always close by. But I think, and I know there are a couple other people, I think it's Lisa Tetro is also working on this kind of intersection of women's rights and the Reconstruction as well, or the Reconstruction time period. So I think there's space there for us to still think about that. And that's one of the other things I should mention about Welter. I mean, she goes from her material covers from 1820 to 1860. cutting off at what I think is like a really critical period, and leaving us to imagine or assume what's moving forward from that time period. So. See, I'm trying to see if anything new is coming up.
We have another Jess comment at the very bottom if you scroll down.
Yes. Where echoes.
And I might ask you to read it out loud just because the Q&A feature isn't visible to all of our
Okay. So Jessica is saying she's very well prepared to be reading and commenting right now. But that Catherine Kish Sklar, who wrote a biography of Catherine Beecher, who I talked about a little bit about earlier, there's echoes of Catherine Beecher's biography and working through why women who were advocates for education ended up at odds with suffragists who often tended to be their students. I wanted to say more about this and then just kind of ran out of time to go pull the quote from the mid 1860s ladies book, because I know we have a ladies book piece about suffrage from 1868 or so, but there's also pieces that Hale is writing, editorials that she's writing, especially after the Moral Land Grant, the Land Grant Act is passed during the Civil War, where she is very concerned about why this money is going to be used to educate men, particularly with this kind of hands-on, not industrial, but kind of mechanical education. And why are there not, why is tax money not going to be used to train women in similar kinds of institutions? And I should have mentioned too earlier, one of her other very, she does so many things across her lifetime. She's also instrumental in the development of Vassar College as well. So she has her hand in these pieces of continuing to think about achieving some kind of equality to some extent, to providing more opportunities for women, to making sure to some extent now that the government is going to provide opportunities, and yet remains convinced throughout this that getting the vote is not the piece that they need. But I always have to go back to the Catherine Beecher biography. I feel it's like that book, there's a book by Karen Haltonen that I read and reread pretty consistently to inform the work that I'm doing, and always see something fresh. So I don't think I see any new things, but I am happy to chat more about anything else.
Amy, I might ask you just to give us a little bit of a preview of coming attractions as we look ahead to the upcoming session.
Absolutely. So I wanted to kind of lay down this foundation and think about Centennial, think about arguments about suffrage and equality, to get us kind of into the material and the kind of background for Women Get Things Done, because ultimately I want this to feature Women Get Things Done, because I know some of us aren't going to get to go and physically see it anytime soon. So I really wanted to be able to highlight that material. So next week or 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about shattering this sphere, and we'll talk more about the reality. I talked a lot about ideals today and the things that people are writing about, but I want to talk more about women's labor and economic power. And I think Connie and I are going to do this as a conversation, really highlighting some of the material from the exhibit itself, which will, at that point, by the time we meet, will actually be open for people to go see. But it also, there's an online version of this. So 2 weeks from now, we'll be talking about more reality-based things in terms of women's work during the Civil War and those post-war years. And then almost a month from now, which is terrifying to think of, but the last piece of this, I've stolen part of the quote from Frances Willard to name it "Aggregated we become batteries of power, benevolent pursuits." So that last session, I want to think about women getting things done collaboratively and in these reform movements overall. So thinking about how women are working together, but not always towards the same ends. So I think it'll be a nice kind of full circle piece to what we were talking about today, and maybe thinking a little bit about how this continues to echo in our culture today in the United States.
That's great. And it's my understanding that with our formal launch of the exhibition on the 22nd next week, the digital edition will be available. So it is my intention to share that link to all of you, along with some session notes, which would include a recording of this session, just in case you know somebody who should have been here but just couldn't make it on a Wednesday evening. And so our goal will be to have a little bit of follow-up there. But this is a little different than a traditional one-off program. I mean, this isn't a fireside chat where it's self-contained. It's a series of events, and I'm really hoping that we could treat this as a seminar that's continuous. And certainly, if you have questions that you want me to pass on to Amy, you could just reply to my emails. But I'm sure that Amy will also respond if you drop her a note at her EDU address too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Always love to hear from fellow Sarah Hale lovers or haters. You can hate her too, either way, but love to talk about Hale too. So
that's great. Well, I'm gonna say that we ought to adjourn here, give folks a little time to prepare their dinners that they've put off to have this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Amy. This has been wonderful. And
thank you all for being here.
For joining.
Thank you, and have a good night, everyone. Hope to see you in 2 weeks.
Absolutely. Take care, all.